The wind in Dust Devil Gulch had a voice, a dry, rasping whisper that promised only thirst and attrition. It was the first thing Anya and Alina learned upon their arrival, a lesson taught not by the tight-lipped matron at the orphanage but by the land itself. At 18, they were no longer the orphanage's concern, cast out with a single threadbare blanket each and a dismissive wave towards the sun-bleached horizon. Their inheritance was a shack on the edge of town, a place left to rot by a prospector who'd chased a rumor of gold and found only bedrock and despair. The cabin slumped like a weary old man, its timbers silvered and splintered, the gaps in its walls plugged with hardened mud that crumbled at a touch. It stood on a patch of land so barren that even the sagebrush seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to die. The townsfolk watched them, two identical figures with the same serious grey eyes and braids of sun-streaked brown hair, moving with a shared, silent purpose. They were a curiosity, a pair of stray cats dumped on the town's doorstep, and pity was a currency as scarce as water. They were given a week's worth of credit at the general store, a gesture that felt more like a timer than charity. Every morning, the sisters would stand outside their cabin, feeling the heat already building in the packed earth, and stare at a sky the color of faded denim, empty of clouds, empty of promise. The town's lifeblood was a single deep well owned by Mr. Alastair Finch, a man whose smile was as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. He sold water by the barrel, his price a quiet tyranny that kept everyone beholden. He lived in the only two-story house, painted a defiant white that mocked the endless brown of the landscape. One evening, as the sky bruised purple with the coming night, Alina spoke, her voice as soft as the dust motes dancing in the last sliver of light. "I remember what grandmother used to say." Anya looked at her, her own thoughts a mirror of her sister's. They had only faint, fractured memories of the woman who had cared for them before the fever took her, memories that felt more like dreams. About the rain, Anya finished, her gaze turning to the sky. She said, "You don't beg the sky for its tears. You build a vessel worthy of catching them when it chooses to weep." The memory was a ghost, a half-forgotten lullaby, but it settled between them with the weight of scripture. The next morning, they did not go into town to look for meager work sweeping floors or mending clothes. They took the two rusty shovels left in the lean-to beside the cabin, their handles cracked and rough against their palms, and began to dig. They did not dig a well, for they had no knowledge of dowsing, no equipment to bore through the deep, unforgiving rock. Instead, Anya marked out a wide circle around the cabin, a perimeter some 10 feet from the walls. This was where their vessel would be. They started to dig a trench, a ditch, a feature so absurd in the parched landscape that it looked like a scar of madness carved into the earth. The work was brutal, a relentless cycle of shock and strain. The topsoil was a thin, powdery layer that gave way to a dense, unforgiving clay studded with rocks. The sun became their overseer, climbing the sky each day to beat down upon their backs. Their hands, soft from years of indoor chores, blistered on the first day. By the third, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin that they wrapped in strips torn from one of their blankets. The people of Dust Devil Gulch noticed. At first, it was quiet murmurs in the general store, whispers behind cupped hands. Then came the open mockery. Men riding past on their way to Finch's well would rein in their horses, gawking at the two girls toiling under the relentless sun. "What you digging for, girls?" one of them called out, a grin splitting his sun-cracked face. "Burying your hopes." His companions laughed, a harsh, grating sound that the wind carried away. Alina's grip tightened on her shovel, her knuckles white, but Anya merely paused, wiped a sleeve across her dusty forehead, and plunged the blade back into the hard earth. The sound of their digging became a part of the town's rhythm, a quiet, persistent folly. The children were the cruelest. They would creep to the edge of the property and chant in sing-song voices, orphan girls, digging a pit, fill it with tears and fall into it. The words were sharp little stones, and though the sisters gave no sign they heard, each one landed with a tiny, bruising impact. Anya focused on the memory of her grandmother's voice, turning it into a shield. A vessel worthy of the tears. This was not a grave for their hopes. It was a cradle. They worked from the first hint of dawn until the light failed, their bodies aching with a profound weariness that settled deep in their bones. They measured their progress not in feet, but in inches, in the growing pile of excavated earth that formed a high berm on the outside of the trench. They were building a moat of dry dirt around a fortress of crumbling wood, a project that made no sense to anyone but them. It was a deep, silent conversation between themselves and the land, a prayer offered not with words, but with sweat and pain and the unyielding rhythm of their labor. The ditch grew deeper, wider. It was no longer a shallow trench but a formidable channel, deep enough now that Alina, standing at the bottom, was barely visible from the cabin's porch. The walls were sheer, cut with a surprising precision from the stubborn clay. The pile of excavated earth on the far side was now a high, solid wall, a rampart of their own making. They had learned the language of the ground beneath their feet, the soft give of silt, the stubborn resistance of rock, the sticky hold of the deep red clay. Their bodies had changed, hardened by the labor. The softness of their youth was baked away, their arms and shoulders corded with lean muscle, their faces tanned to the color of worn leather. They moved with an economy of motion, their swings powerful and sure, their shared rhythm unbroken. One day, Alastair Finch himself rode out to see them. He sat atop a fine black horse, his suit immaculate despite the dust, a stark figure of wealth and power against the bleak landscape. He did not dismount, looking down at them from his elevated position as if they were peculiar insects. "I confess," he began, his voice smooth and condescending, "I am intrigued by your industry. What, precisely, is the purpose of this excavation?" Anya leaned on her shovel, her grey eyes meeting his without fear or deference. "We're preparing," she said, her voice even. Finch chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Preparing for what, child? A flood? Look at that sky. God himself has forgotten this place." He gestured with a gloved hand at the vast, empty blue. "You are wasting what little strength you have digging a mud puddle for orphans. The only water you'll find here is at my well." For a price the threat was unspoken but clear. He was the master of this land because he was the master of its water. The sisters ignored him. They turned back to their work, the rhythmic scrape and thud of their shovels a clear dismissal. Finch watched them for a long moment, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Their refusal to be cowed, to even properly acknowledge his power, was an affront. He saw their plot of land not as a home, but as an untidy piece of a larger map he intended to own. These girls, with their silent toil and their nonsensical ditch, were a temporary inconvenience. "Don't come crying to me when your tongues are swollen with thirst," he said, turning his horse. He rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a silence that felt heavier than before. The town saw his visit, and the sisters' silent defiance, as the height of foolishness. They were poking the bear, the very man who held their survival in his hands. The mockery lessened, replaced by a grim, head-shaking pity. The consensus was that the sun had finally cooked their wits. They were digging their own graves, and soon enough, the town would have to deal with the consequences. But Anya and Alina did not see it that way. Finch's visit had only hardened their resolve. He spoke of the sky as if it were an enemy, a miserly king holding back its bounty. They saw it as a partner, a force of immense power that simply required patience and a proper welcome. Their ditch was an act of faith in a world that ran on coin and cynicism. They were not digging a grave, they were shaping a promise into the earth. Then, one afternoon, the world changed. The brassy glare of the sun softened, veiled by a high, thin layer of grey. The air, usually so dry it cracked the skin, grew thick and heavy, carrying the distant, loamy scent of petrichor. The wind died down, and a profound stillness settled over Dust Devil Gulch. The townsfolk looked up from their work, sniffing the air like cautious animals. Hope, an emotion long since baked out of them, stirred faintly. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to the color of a bruise. A low, resonant rumble echoed from the horizon, a sound so unfamiliar it was startling. The sisters stood by their finished ditch, two silent sentinels watching the approaching storm. Their work was done. The channel encircled their cabin completely, a massive, empty basin nearly 8 feet deep and 12 feet across, the high berm of earth protecting it from runoff. It was a strange and ugly feature, a gaping wound in the land. As the first fat drop of rain struck the dust at Anya's feet, sending up a tiny puff, she looked at Alina and allowed herself a small, weary smile. The sky was about to weep, and they had built a vessel worthy of its tears. The rain began as a sprinkle, then a steady drumming, and then it became a deluge. It was not a gentle shower but a violent, cathartic release, as if the sky were emptying itself of a long-held sorrow. Water streamed from the cabin's warped roof, pouring into the ditch. It ran in rivulets across the baked earth, finding its way into the channel they had so painstakingly carved. The town, which had prayed for rain, now huddled indoors as the storm unleashed its full fury. The single dusty street became a river of mud. For 2 days and 2 nights, the rain fell. When it finally stopped, the world was washed clean, the air crisp and cool. The sun rose on a landscape transformed. Every hollow was a puddle, every gully a running stream. And around the sisters' cabin, where there had been a dry, ugly scar, there was now a perfect circle of shining, placid water. The ditch was full. It held the sky's gift, a shimmering, near-bottomless moat of life-giving water. The townsfolk emerged, blinking in the bright, clean light. They saw the miracle at the edge of town and fell silent. The mockery, the pity, it all evaporated in the morning sun. What they saw was not a fool's trench, but a reservoir. Anya and Alina sat on their porch, watching the water settle, its surface reflecting the vast, now empty sky. They had not begged. They had prepared. Their faith had been answered not by a god in the heavens, but by the very sky Finch had scorned. The water was muddy at first, but they were patient. They let the silt settle, a process that took days. The clay they had dug through, the very substance that had made the work so difficult, now formed a near-impermeable lining, holding the water fast against the thirsty ground. While the temporary puddles and streams around the town evaporated quickly under the returning sun, their great circle of water remained deep and cool and clear. Old Man Hemlock, a trapper who lived in the hills and rarely came to town, was the first to understand. He walked to the edge of their property, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, and simply nodded at the sisters. "The earth gives back what you give it," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You gave it your sweat. It gives you this." He didn't ask for water. He simply acknowledged their wisdom, a quiet blessing from one outsider to another. The storm was a brief reprieve, a fleeting memory. The sun returned with a vengeance, fiercer than before, as if angered by the intrusion of clouds. The summer began in earnest, a season of brutal, unrelenting heat. The ground, briefly softened, baked again into a crust as hard as iron. The desert plants that had greened after the rain withered and turned brown. The puddles vanished, then the creeks dried up, leaving behind cracked beds of mud that crumbled into dust. The thirst returned to Dust Devil Gulch, deeper and more desperate than ever. Finch's well, the town's sole reliance, began to show the strain. The water level dropped. The bucket came up slower, yielding less with each turn of the windlass. Sensing the growing panic, Finch did what men like him always do, he capitalized on it. He doubled the price of a barrel of water. A week later, he doubled it again. Grumbling turned to outrage, but outrage was a useless currency. People paid. They sold tools, heirlooms, anything of value to afford the few precious gallons needed to keep their families and their livestock alive. The town began to shrink under the pressure. Tempers frayed. The thin veneer of community cracked under the strain of shared desperation. People watched their neighbors with suspicion, counting the barrels, guarding their own meager supply. And every day, their eyes would drift to the edge of town, to the impossible sight of the sisters' cabin, surrounded by its calm, deep, and seemingly endless ring of water. The ditch was no longer a joke, it was a shimmering symbol of everything they lacked. It was salvation, held in the hands of 2 girls they had ridiculed. The day the well ran dry was a day of reckoning. The bucket came up with nothing but mud and gravel. A collective groan of despair rose from the small crowd gathered at the wellhead. Alastair Finch stood on his porch, his face a mask of indifference. "The well is dry," he announced, as if speaking of the weather. Unfortunate, but these things happen. His gaze swept over the desperate faces and landed, inevitably, on the horizon, in the direction of the sisters' cabin. He had underestimated them, and now their folly was his problem. His monopoly was broken, his power rendered meaningless by a ditch full of rainwater. The town was paralyzed by fear. The nearest other source of water was a 2-day ride away, an impossible journey for most, especially with no water for the journey itself. The silence was broken by the sheriff, a weary man named Hobbs. He turned his gaze from Finch to the silent crowd, and then he, too, looked toward the cabin. There was only one choice. He started walking, his boots kicking up puffs of dust, and one by one, the people of Dust Devil Gulch fell in behind him. It was not a mob, it was a pilgrimage. They walked in silence, a long, shuffling procession of the thirsty and the desperate, their buckets and barrels banging softly against their legs. They were coming to beg for what the sisters had built while they had laughed. Anya and Alina saw them coming. They stood on their porch, side by side, their faces calm and unreadable. They did not look afraid or triumphant. They simply waited. The procession stopped at the edge of their property, at the bank of the great earthen berm. Sheriff Hobbs stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "Ma'ams," he said, his voice hoarse. "We were wrong. We were fools. Now. We're thirsty. We're asking for your help." Alastair Finch arrived last, on his fine black horse, pushing his way through the crowd. His face was contorted with rage and disbelief. This was his town, his dominion, and these orphans were usurping his authority with nothing but mud and rainwater. "This is preposterous," he boomed, trying to reclaim control. "That water is sitting on my land. I hold the original deed to this entire quadrant." It was a lie, a desperate gambit. The prospector's claim had been properly filed and abandoned, the deed transferred to the orphanage and then to the girls. "This is their land, Finch," Sheriff Hobbs said, his voice tired but firm. "And that is their water." Finch dismounted, his expensive boot sinking into the dust. He stormed toward the sisters, his face livid. "I will buy it from you," he snarled, pulling a thick wallet from his coat. "Name your price." Every last drop. Anya looked not at the money, but at the faces in the crowd. She saw the mothers holding listless children, the old men whose eyes were sunken with dehydration, the shame and desperation on the faces of the men who had mocked them. She saw a community on the brink of collapse. She then looked at Finch, a man who would let them all perish to protect his profit. Her gaze was as clear and steady as the water behind her. "It is not for sale," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. Alina stepped forward and picked up a bucket. She walked to the edge of the ditch, dipped it into the cool, clear water, and carried it, brimming, to Sheriff Hobbs. She offered it to him. He took it, his hands trembling slightly, and drank deeply. Then he passed it to the woman next to him. A second bucket was filled, and a third. The sisters began to work, their movements fluid and practiced, filling the buckets and barrels of the people who had scorned them. They asked for nothing in return. The ditch, their great, mad project, became the heart of Dust Devil Gulch. It sustained them through the worst drought in living memory. The water level lowered slowly, inch by inch, but their grandmother's wisdom and their own foresight had made it deep enough. They organized a fair system of rationing, with the sisters overseeing the daily distribution, ensuring everyone, from the most prominent citizen to the poorest family, received their share. Alastair Finch was broken. His power, built on the control of a single resource, crumbled to dust. No one bought land from him, no one sought his counsel, no one feared his displeasure. He was just a man in a big white house with a dry well. He eventually sold his property for a fraction of its worth and left town, a bitter ghost vanquished not by force, but by the quiet resilience of 2 young women and their belief in the sky. The community was transformed. The shared crisis and the sisters' unconditional generosity had forged a new bond between them. They began to work together, planting a communal garden near the ditch, irrigated by its water. They built a small schoolhouse, and Anya and Alina, who had been taught to read and write at the orphanage, became its first teachers. The ditch was no longer called the Orphan's Folly, it was known as the Sisters' Circle. It became a permanent feature of the town, a landmark and a legend. Every autumn, before the rains were due, the whole town would work together to clear it of silt and reinforce its banks, a communal ritual of gratitude and preparation. Anya and Alina never lauded their victory over anyone. They remained as they had always been, quiet, determined, and deeply connected to the land and to each other. They had faced a hostile world with nothing but a half-remembered piece of wisdom and their own 2 hands, and they had not only survived, they had flourished, bringing their entire community along with them. They had built a vessel to catch the sky's tears, and in doing so, had shown a town dying of thirst how to hope again.